Okay, jolly good. Right, okay, so the reason why I'm doing this, or the reason why you're here, there's a number of reasons. First of all, HSBC is raising awareness for members of staff who've got mental health issues. So raising awareness about mental health in general in the workplace. And part of this discussion is about a mental health situation that I found myself in over the summer. Further to that, the actual drive to do this talk came from a result of that talk with Woody and his son about the positive thinking talk. Were you all at that one? Were you at that beat? Yeah. No?
No.
Okay. So the general gist, I'm going to compact it very much into a very brief description, but the general gist was about going about your life in a more positive way, using positive language, and you'll find that if you put more positivity out into the world, you'll get more positivity back into your life. It's a very sound principle of mindfulness. So there was a couple of discussions I overheard and that I engaged in the office after that talk. And one of the sort of, not so much criticisms, but observations was that it didn't really recognise individual persona. So an example that Woody gave in the talk, Woody was a presenter, was that his wife asked for a cup of tea and he was very positive and said, yes, I'll make you a cup of tea, rather than moping about it or being reluctant to do it. So Mike Hardy, what he said was that he would traditionally give a sarcastic response. And his sarcasm would be, no, I won't make the cup of tea, but that would be his positivity and that would be appropriate to his situation. So that was one criticism or observation, sorry. My observation was that it was talking about mindfulness, which is really the secular version of spirituality, which is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about Taoism, which is an ancient Chinese traditional philosophy, and a lot of the ideas that are now dressed up come under the term of mindfulness are actually spirituality. But I appreciate that the presentation that we had before it was really a corporate package and it was limited in time. So perhaps they didn't have the time to recognize these sort of old philosophies. But I thought, I'm really into them. I find them really fascinating and they've helped me a lot through my troubles. And I thought I'd share them with you. My third motivation is really just what I was saying, that I want to share Taoism with as many people as I can. That's just my motivation. I think that the more Taoism there is in the world, the better. The first thing I'll do is, before I talk about Taoism, is talk about my mental health episode, which is over the summer. Some of you may have noticed that I wasn't here for a period of time, or that my behaviour might have been slightly out of character. I don't know. But I'll give you the background. It's a relationship story. So the background is I was previously married several years ago, and I had a child, and I subsequently left that marriage. And I carried quite a lot of guilt from doing that because I was separating myself from a family unit and my son voluntarily. And I tried to make up for it by investing a lot of energy into making sure that I saw my son a lot after the breakup. But it was a very painful process, and I still carry some guilt from that. So then I got into another relationship, and my girlfriend fell pregnant, which was all planned and fantastic, and we were very happy. And then in the build-up to last Christmas, not the one just gone, that was when the pregnancy period was. The relationship started to break down, and then subsequently she left me, or she left the relationship just after Christmas, so early in the year. My way of dealing with it at the time was to increase my intake in alcohol primarily. So I started drinking increasingly in the evenings, or I started increasing my drinking in the evenings. And it, in hindsight, it was probably to cover up the emotional sort of issues I was having, or to not deal with them. So I got up to about 2 bottles of wine a night quite comfortably. If I tried to do that now, I'd have some difficulty operating, but I got used to it. My body got used to it. I was also gambling at the time as well, and that was an escapism, and that came with the drinking. When you're a bit drunk, you make stupid decisions, and I was doing it every night. So I was into football gambling anyways, but then I started escalating, and I got into, a considerable amount of debt doing that, which I'm still dealing with now as a result of that. I tried the positive thinking thing. Sorry, I'll rewind a little bit first, actually. I reached a point where I realised I was damaging my health and my physical and mental health. And I cut my drinking right down to stop drinking during the week, more or less. And I started to meditate and get back into Taoism, which I've had a relationship with over a number of years. And I noticed an improvement in my sort of well-being, but I developed panic attacks. So I got rid of one problem and another problem started. You can psychoanalyze that if you want, but that's just what happens. Or happened to me. So the panic attacks were infrequent. They happened every now and again. I had a couple of days off work here and there. In that period, I was a little bit mentally unstable, and I did occasionally come into work and tried this positivity thing that we had in this talk, where I'd just try and be positive all day long. And I did find that the downside of it was that it could be a little bit tiresome to people, even though I did notice a positive change. If you're positive all the time, you do see your environment change around you in a positive way, but you also notice that some people find it a bit tiresome. So that's the downside to that. So it was around this point that I noticed the positivity was helping, and I noticed a change. And one of the changes was that my relationship seemed to be sort of coming back together with my ex-partner. And then I set my expectations very high and thought, I'm going to have my daughter back in my life, which was the primary reason that, I fell into sort of a depressive state, because this new life had come into the world and then she was taken away from me. So then, I set my expectations high, and then the relationship the budding new version of the relationship collapsed, and then the rug got pulled from underneath me, and then I fell into quite a deep depression. It was around the summer, just before I took time off, or I signed off work, and I was in a state of a panic attack one evening, and I was carrying a pair of scissors. And I remember looking in a mirror and seeing the scissors and seeing my neck. And then I was seriously considering sticking the scissors in my neck as an option to sort of end the situation, the feeling that I was experiencing at the time. I want to be respectful to people that do attempt suicide, because I considered suicide, very seriously considered it during a panic attack. But one thing I will just say, if you haven't had a panic attack, the experience that I had, which might be different to other people's, is an feeling of enclosure, claustrophobia, like being in a caged room. If you do ever find yourself in one, a good tip or mantra I came across on a podcast was, you're in a caged room, but the door is wide open. That's a good thing to think about. At the time, I didn't have that to hand. I was just in the enclosed room, and the only thing I could think about was, how can I get out of it? And that was one of the options. So that was a really dark and unpleasant experience that I had. That was the peak or the bottom of the bottle, the bottom of my mental state. That's probably the lowest I've ever been, definitely the lowest I've ever been. And at that point, I was subsequently signed off work. And during that time, I used it to go to the gym quite a lot. After about 2 days where I was almost completely incapable of getting out of bed. It was like a physical illness. I couldn't even motivate myself or physically get myself out of bed, other than to go to the toilet or to get a snack. So after that, I started to go to the gym. The gym's very good. This talk is not about the benefits of exercise and mental health. They are known to everyone, and I would highly encourage, exercise if you find yourself in a bad place. But this is about the spiritual journey that I took after that, especially. And this is where Taoism comes into play. Right, I'm going to try and explain what Taoism is now. And I think the best way to do it is to do a diagram. Right. Right, does anyone know what this is?
Yin and yang.
Yeah, it's yin and yang. So this is the visual manifestation of about 10,000 years of observations of nature in ancient China. It tells us a lot of stuff, and we can use it in a lot of ways, and I will show you a couple of ways in which you can use it. Okay, let me know if you need to see it from anyway. One thing it shows us is it's opposites. It's a philosophy of opposites, really, if I'm going to boil it down. But the first thing it tells you is there's no absolutes. So you've got a bit of yin in yang and a bit of yang in yin. You can see that they're almost like drops of water, and that is a deliberate effect because these are the observations that have been done by these wise people in China are observations of nature. So this is really, I'll describe what the Tao is described as on Google. So the Tao derives from the way or the path and refers to the underlying organization and unfolding events of the universe. Okay, one thing that makes it quite easy to understand how I see the world through Taoism is to give a couple of anecdotes, for example. So for instance, if I wake up in the morning, I'll use this yin as chaos and this yang as order. Those are two opposites that I find really useful. They can be any opposite. They can be male and female, they can be night and day, doesn't matter. But if we say this is chaos and this is order, this is really how my life feels a lot of the time, governed between those two forces. So when I wake up in the morning, I'm just come out of a dream state, I don't know what's what, I'm somewhere over here, deeply in chaos. Gradually I pull my thoughts together, I come towards the middle, order starts to manifest, I brush my teeth, go upstairs, I wake my son up, and suddenly I'm plunged back into chaos again. And then that cycle continues throughout the day. But one thing I should say, this is really important, is that's not bad and that's not good. The concept of good and bad don't really make sense in Taoism. They might make sense, but they're not really useful to me. So to use that example I just gave, like that bit where my son plunges me back into chaos, that might be him engaging me in some kind of fight, which derails breakfast, like sets my deadlines all haywire. But that might be the most enjoyable bit of his day. That might be his enduring memory of me for that day. So that's what I mean by, the good and bad. Same with order. Order sounds brilliant, but this was alluded to in that talk. If you live over here somewhere where you're obsessive about order to the point where no one can put a foot wrong in your house, you become a tyrant. And that's no fun for anyone. But you might have a really well-ordered house. So it's the dance between these two things. Same if you pick up a complaint, don't know what's going on. You gradually sort of understand through investigation, you come into order, you speak to the customer, he throws new problems at you, back into chaos. It's this fluctuation between the two. So if you can imagine these sides expanding and contracting, and that's basically how I sort of generally perceive the world throughout the day. And what the idea is, this line here is the way. So that is the way, the path that I mentioned in that description. And if you can live your life as close to that as possible and keep those fluctuations to a minimum, that is the Taoist way. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Right. So one of the things that is interesting to me is that is about my perception of the world that I just gave you there, those descriptions, those anecdotes. This principle also applies to the physical world, so matter, like this table, for instance, on a very, very small scale, right up to the very, very biggest scale, the cosmos. So the very, very small scale, I'll give you an example, an atom, positive charge, electron on the outside, perfectly balanced, the two things working in harmony to create a stable substance or stable matter. Up to the very, very big scale, the cosmos, the same thing applies. It's recognized by scientists. I bought this book just to demonstrate that it's not just me saying this, that other people have recognized this. This is the Tao of physics, so this is a whole sort of book on that subject. I was reading a Scientific American article not so long ago where they were talking about Taoism, and it's still relevant in modern science. And what I find interesting about that is it's Eastern mysticism and modern science is the ultimate yin-yang. and the two things can work in harmony. So it's an example within an example, which I find quite interesting. Right, I'm going to use this yin yang again in a slightly different way now to show you how I use it for my mental health, or how I have used it especially. In fact, I do use it every day. So in this instance, the yin, this is the contractive side, the dark side, is going to be the past, and the yang is going to be the future. I'm just going to talk about the problematic elements of those things, because this is about mental health. Some of you might not have mental problems or stresses in your lives. If you don't, then come and see me afterwards, and I'd like to know how you deal with it. So the past, the problem with the past is that all of us, it doesn't matter how hard you are, and I obviously am, we've all had suffering in our lives. Like, it's all relative to the individual. You might think that one person's suffering is more than the next, but we've all had suffering. It doesn't matter who you are. And this is one of the things that Buddha recognized, and his path to enlightenment was inspired by seeing suffering in the world. He came from quite a well-to-do family, and he left the family and he went out into the world and he just saw suffering, and then gradually it led to him becoming the Buddha. I'm mentioning Buddha because Buddhism is really is fantastic for this kind of thing, for compassion and suffering. Zen Buddhism, which is a type of Buddhism, and Taoism are very, very closely aligned. Unlike some religions, they coexist quite happily and share ideas and philosophies, etc. I'll read out a quote from the Dalai Lama, which I just think is a really beautiful way of seeing how suffering can be used as a positivity, as a positive force. So this one is as follows. Some people who are sweet and attractive, strong and healthy, happen to die young. They are masters in disguise, teaching us about impermanence. I just think that's a really beautiful way of seeing things. I mean, a lot of personal developments, from my observation, comes out of trauma, and that really is one of the sort of the tenets of spirituality, as in exactly what I'm talking about, Taoism. I'll give another anecdote which is relevant to Louise here, who has clearly the Tao running through her, because she came in one day after crashing her car, and rather than moaning about the problems that had presented her with, such as having to pay another person, she saw the positives and talked about how she shouldn't really have been driving in the first place. Sorry, I'm just quoting you. I'm just hoping that I'm accurate. Tell me if I'm wrong. Yeah. But you were driving with your windows fogged up, and you weren't really paying enough attention. And what you learned from it was that you should have been paying attention, and you shouldn't have been driving with your windows fogged up. And that's really important that in terms of, the spiritual approach, the Taoist approach, you took accountability for it. And the payment that you had to make to the other person was almost like a penance, to teach you those things so you won't do it again. That was really interesting to hear that coming from you, without you having this kind of same, background that I have. Right. So that was the past. The future's where I really have more problems, and that's to do with anxiety. The panic attacks I had were all about what's going to happen, that voice in your head that's constantly telling you what's going to happen, I'm going to do that wrong, do that wrong. And it's happened before every one of these talks where I think, or even during it, if I feel I'm getting derailed slightly or I lose my words, I think I'm going to mess it up, and then I start, that feeling starts to come over you where you start to panic. That's really the problem. I'll share a little anecdote, another one, where my ex-wife emailed me, if I could do it justice and remember it, but she emailed me asking me how I was going to deal with Christmas with 2 kids, 2 ex-partners, and a crazy schedule and doing work at the same time. And my answer was, I thought I'd give her a Taoist answer in the tradition of this talk, and it was, I'm going to be like water. Luckily, she knew what I was talking about, didn't think I was crazy. And she said, the obstacle becomes the destination. And then my response was, the destination becomes the journey. So it was a little play on words that we did with each other, but essentially what I'm trying to sort of draw out of it is that a really good way of coping with situations where you feel like you don't have full control over them is to use the example of water, which is what Taoists do a lot. If you think about or you observe water, it just follows the natural path. Gravity just pushes it down and it just takes the route it needs to. You can put as many boulders in front of it as you want. It will just keep going. So that was really useful to me, and it might potentially be useful to you. As I said earlier, the goal is to be here. That it has its own name in Taoism. It's called Wu Wei. And you may have noticed that I've put this here. And the reason I put that there is because it's on the background of my phone, and I'm using my phone to record the audio for this, so I didn't want to mess it up, which is what I've been doing in the previous talks. I've been showing it on my phone. But this is Wu Wei. I mentioned Zen Buddhism earlier. You'll probably be familiar with Zen. They are just people saying Zen. That's what it means. It means living in the present, not living in the past, not living in the future. The past and the future don't exist. They only exist in our mind. So one of the major criticisms or observations from the East of the West is that we live our lives in our mind too much. And it is very, very true, especially in this modern world with all these mental health problems. Amusing story. I was on a date with a Chinese girl, and I showed her my Wu Wei image on my phone to impress her, and she looked at it and went, do nothing. And then I proceeded to educate her about her own language and tell her that no, it means spontaneous, effortless spontaneity. That's my translation of it. Effortless spontaneity. It's a different way of saying living in the moment. I just thought it was funny because I was trying to teach a Chinese girl Mandarin, but the point of that is, part of it just being funny, is that Mandarin translates in many different ways, but that does actually literally mean do nothing. But don't mistake that for like literally doing nothing, because that would be really weird and boring. That's why I gave it the different translation. So a little technique that I will share with you, which I've partly stolen from a TED video about mental health and Taoism, and partly incorporated some other bits over time that have been useful to me. I'll just share it with you. You may or may not ever need to use it. You might hopefully you'll just find it relatively interesting. But it's basically a meditation technique. It's using the yin yang, and this time it's separating my consciousness. So the Taoist philosophy more or less believes that life is theatre, and we're all actors in that theatre. So in this case, what I'm going to do is talk about my true self as the yin. So I'm separating my true self, which I'm going to sort of point at the back of my head here, because that's where I like to imagine it. This also derives from a Tai Chi method. So posture is very important. So straightening the back and straightening the neck is very important. Qi is your vital energy. Tai Chi's come out of this philosophy as well. It's Taoist. If you think about the central nervous system, you're on the sort of same lines as Qi. Okay, so there's two reasons for this. One is for doing this thing with the posture. One is the Tai Chi, doing that justice. And the second one is it's almost like a trigger. It reminds me to do it. So if I'm feeling stressed or angry or jealous or resentful or anything, nervous, I sit my head back and it's a trigger. It reminds me. So I find that really useful. So I do that, and then usually I close my eyes and I sit myself back in the back of my head in my true self. So the front bit, that my physical body, the bit that you all know as Owen, that's the yang. That's the outward representation of me, but it's not necessarily my true self. So I make that separation in my body. Then what I tend to do when I feel anger or any of those feelings I just described, I tend to get an abdominal feeling. Don't know if you do as well. Like I get a feeling down here and I get an increased heartbeat. Sometimes I get little shots with adrenaline that just make my chest feel weird. So what I do when I'm in that state is I focus on those things rather than trying to push them away or ignore them. And by focusing on them, they tend to go away a lot quicker. And the same thing with my mind. I'm focusing on the physical body, but I'm also focusing on the yang, the outward representation, where these thoughts are happening, where I'm thinking, why didn't they do that thing? Why haven't they answered my email, etc., etc. And I try and watch those thoughts from my true self, which is why I have the front-back dynamic. So I try and watch the thoughts come and go. I don't try and stop them. I just let them happen, and then they will gradually fade away. If you can do that, I can't claim this with any scientific proof, but mental health problems will become a lot easier for you. They certainly have for me anyway. That is, like I said, a kind of meditation technique. And I just wanted to, there's only two more bits to this talk. And one of them, I just want to dispel any kind of myths about meditation or reasons not to do meditation. A lot of people who I've encountered seem to think that meditation requires, a lot of time, a lot of dedication, that you need to have results, such as having a clear mind when you meditate, or you need a silent place in your house to do it. You don't need any of these things. I meditate in the gym, in the sauna. People are always talking. I do the same thing that I was just describing now. I let the noise just come and go. I don't let it bother me. I don't attach emotions to those noises. I still have reeling thoughts and voices in my head and conversations, but what I just keep doing is just bringing myself back to the present constantly. And I do. I'm in the sauna, so I can't do it for very long, 10 minutes tops. I just wanted to really put that across. I also don't sit in the lotus position because I've got a hip problem. I can't do it. You can do it anywhere, anytime. You can do it for 10 seconds. Sometimes I literally do it for a few seconds after I park my car before I walk into work. The reason I'm trying to dispel these kind of myths is because I don't want you to feel as though you shouldn't do it, because I think everyone should do it, because it just makes life a bit more tranquil and a bit nicer, and it just helps you deal with problems a bit more, I think. Last thing, this is the Dao de Jing. This is the book of Taoism. It was written 600 years BC by Lao Tzu. Obviously, I said it was 10,000 years old. There are a lot of people before him, so he culminated a lot of information and put it into this really incredible book. If you want to come and have a look at it after the talk, at any point, it'll be on my desk for a while. I highly recommend it. It's a really, really excellent book, full of wisdom. It's not solid writing. It's little pithy, sort of, almost, they're all presented like poems, but they're not poems really. I'm going to read one out, and then that'll be, I'll conclude the talk. So this is chapter 8, and this one sort of sums it up for me, really, the philosophy. So, the supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without trying to. It is content with the low places that people disdain. Thus it is like the Tao. In dwelling, live close to the ground. In thinking, keep to the simple. In conflict, be fair and generous. In governing, don't try to control. In work, do what you enjoy. In family life, be completely present. When you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everybody will respect you. And that one really sort of resonates with me. There's a couple of reasons. One, that it recognises conflict in the world. So any perception that you have about sort of spirituality being about, holding hands and hugging trees, that stuff's really good. But this recognises that, life does have a dark and a light side, a yin and a yang. And also being completely present in your family life. With mobile phones, I think that's something we can all take a leaf out of that book, if you know what I mean. Okay, that's it in my talk. Thank you. If you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer them. Not a bit of time.
I have a question about when you've got the thoughts going through your head and you're driving you crazy on everybody else's at times. When you said you acknowledge them, you listen to them and let them go, how do you do that?
What I try and do is, the important bit is making that separation in the first place into your true self, because your true self is not having those thoughts. So if you can do that, if you can make that imaginary separation, you can observe them. You might still be having them, but if you can observe them, then the more you observe them, potentially, the more ridiculous they may seem.
Like in a third person.
Like in a third person, yeah, exactly that. So you might start to see them slightly differently if you're observing them from a third person position, because what you're doing is you're detaching emotion from the thought. You're making that separation. And spirituality is all about letting go, detachment. It's not about accumulation. It's about letting go. It takes practice.
Them and then listen them back to them to yourself. You think, what the hell?
Exactly,
are you talking
and
about?
You might see it as like comical or whatever, but different to how you felt it at the time. But meditation is called practice for a reason. There's only been small improvements in the clarity of my mind that I did when I've been doing it, but the feeling I get after I do it is really noticeable. So my life has been more tranquil, is the best word, I suppose, as a result of doing it. Even though when I'm doing it, sometimes my mind's going, it doesn't matter, just don't, try to detach from it.
I'm in my head a lot, but now I am.
I think I've got from it is just that you can't stop things happening, you can't change things happening, it's how you deal with it and how you react to it, isn't it?
Control is a bit of an illusion, I've sort of come to terms with.
Struggling with the control freak inside.
Is that everything? Is everyone all right?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.